Ah, good.
And we're definitely online. I'm so happy because I know yesterday, yeah, that was, yeah, really, I don't know what happened yesterday, but we weren't online yesterday. So I'm so glad to be back. And just in case, I will absolutely check it on my phone now, which might give us slight, but I just want to double check. But I'm sure we are. And somebody will say that we're online in a minute, hopefully. We will get somebody saying hi, but I will look at the page and see what's there. Yes, we're live, we're online. So that's good. And we have a few people with us. So that's fantastic. Yes, 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 yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We had a bit of trouble yesterday. We don't know what happened. We were here having the interview, but you weren't for some reason. And we're not too sure why, but we're here today. And I'm very grateful. Hey, Kezia. I'm so grateful that Robert could do it again, and I really appreciate that. Oh, Matthew, thank you so much for saying that. Hi. Yes, 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 yes. So Robert, we first met, as we always talk about something that we first met, was when we were doing Nachiketa, Nigel Osborne's Nachiketa, and you were filming the process, wasn't you?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it was Nigel Osborne, Ariel Dolphman did the libretto, and we had Tina Ellen Lee and Opera Circus who were kind of making that happen for all of us. William Conway from the Hebrides and the Hebrides Ensemble, actually, and Darren Abrahams, who we've had on this Safe at Home live sessions as well. Laurie Lixenberg, who we've also had, and we've had Tina Ellen Lee as well, and Plakiti Dutta and Andy Morton. And you were just so... You gave us such a special experience of kind of documenting that for us. And do you enjoy documenting work like that?
It's it's really wonderful, and it's very interesting because there is a relationship between photojournalism and documenting theater. In that, when you think about it, photojournalists have to select precisely the moment to release the shutter,
Yeah, yeah,
to capture the peak of the action, and in particular the peak of the emotion.
yeah, yeah,
What I tell young people quite often is you're not photographing light reflecting off objects alone. You're
yeah.
photographing emotion. That's what you should be looking for,
Well, that's
because
what
it's the sorry.
yeah, sorry, that's because that's what I love about everything that you do is that you can see the emotion. And it's 9:01, so I've got to start the Safe at Home. 9:01, everybody. Hi, I am Nadine Benjamin. I am an international soprano, and I'm also a certified high performance coach and an NLP mind coach. And I'm here during these next 4 weeks just bringing with you the phenomenal people that I know and love in my life who are going to share with you their insights, their gifts, while we are safe at home during this time, and give you some new tips and new ways of looking at things. And today we get the lucky pleasure. I mean, I really do feel overwhelmed and lucky that we have the wonderful, phenomenal Robert Golden. And Robert Golden has produced many photo stories, written, directed over 40 documentaries, 2 award-winning feature films, and 900 TV commercials. He has written 3 plays, 40 film scripts, 1 novel, poems and essays about photography, politics, and culture. Recently, he has been teaching young people about democracy and about photo film storytelling for various EU projects. His novel, A Forgettable Man, has been republished, and a collection of essays called A Role for Artists in Troubled Times, which I cannot recommend anymore. It's just amazing, this piece of work, A Role for Artists in Troubled Times, and very relevant for this time, was published in January 2019. He recently finished a lockdown film opera, which I was in as a snail, by Nigel Osborne called Osman and His SNAILS, in support of a human rights prisoner, which has had more than 15 million views, and has just finished This Good Earth, a documentary about soil and climate change, landscape and species extinction, and food, diets and disease, to be released in January the 21st, 2021, which we will hear more about later. Thank you, Robert. And also, as I always say to everybody, please, some people are still have high anxiety. Everybody is suffering from some sort of low level of trauma during this time. Please, please, please pick up the phone to someone. If you know someone can't pick up the phone to themselves, pick up the phone for them. Walk round, drop a card in, write a letter, do something, anything that just puts us all in connection. Invite them to Safe at Home time. And just, let's just be in connection today. But now I would really love to get out of the way and just be with this wonderful man, Robert Golden. Thank you for being here, Robert.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to however many of you are sitting blurry-eyed with your cup of tea or cup of coffee.
Oh, so tell us, what set you on the journey of photography?
When I was a child, I was about 8 years old, I was asked by the Detroit Board of Education to attend Saturday morning classes at the Detroit Institute of Art, which is Detroit's main museum. And I did. And there were lovely, I mean, now looking back at it, I mean, there were lovely young people who were the teachers and cared for the children beautifully. I mean, I felt very safe there. And every week they would take us and show us one thing in particular in the museum. Now, remember that Detroit at that time was the seventh wealthiest city in the world because of the fact that it produced motor cars and tanks and rockets and so on. And so the museum was very well clad financially. At any rate, in the 1930s, they had asked the famous revolutionary Mexican muralist, Diego Rivera, if he would paint the story of Detroit. And it was in this huge arboretum with a glass ceiling, triple story high, and a very large space. Every wall was covered by this man's painting. And it told the story, essentially, of modern day humanity from peasants, and I don't use the word pejoratively, growing food, women growing crops, and that being turned into food by the women using the Mexican metate, and people eating the food and having a family life, and then digging the raw ore that went onto ships that crossed the ocean and went through the Great American Lakes and Lake Erie and the Erie Canal and wound up at the deepwater port in Detroit, where it was offloaded and turned into steel, which was then turned into automobiles. At any rate, I stood there as an 8-year-old looking at these beautiful, beautiful images. Absolutely beautiful. You can find them online, by the way, if you just do Diego Rivera Detroit murals.
I've seen them, Robert. They're astounding.
They are astounding. And like all things, it's not the same looking at them as a two-dimensional image on our computers as opposed to being in that space and looking at them. And it is overwhelming. At any rate, I stood there and I think tears coming out of my eyes, and I just was so deeply moved by it. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to make images that will tell stories. And 2 years later, so this was 1955, I came across a Life magazine special memorial, a commemorative issue about the war in the Pacific. And so I was turning the sort of semi-glossy pages. It was very well reproduced. I came across this group of maybe 10 or 12, 15 images of the war in the Pacific. And I was totally transformed by it. I had never seen anything like it before. And they are a very particular set of pictures by a photographer named W. Eugene Smith, who is also, as I found out later, a Midwesterner. And anyway, at that moment, I realized that I didn't want to draw and paint. What I wanted to do was photograph. Why? I don't know. I mean, I never had any particular interest in photography, but that set my life. I mean, all I've done for my entire life is make pictures and make films.
Wow. So how did that kind of lead into filmmaking? Oh, I'm just hearing this, Marjorie. Marjorie's saying, I'm a bit blurry-eyed with my cup of coffee. Good morning, both. Good morning. Marjorie's also saying, again, early experiences influence all that come after. Yeah. So tell us a little bit, how did that move into filmmaking?
All the way through high school. Well, at the end of elementary school and through high school, I was photographing. And quite seriously, I was photographing. Apparently, I transformed the way in which American high school annuals are made, because I decided at that time you were given a speed graphics camera, which was this. You've seen them in the 1940s films. They have, they're very big and they have a flash here, and so those things. But at the same time, of course, the a handful of famous photographers started using the Leica camera back in the 1930s. Very small and very mobile. And that's what I did. I became the high school annuals photographer.
Oh, wow.
And I photographed everything,
Yeah.
but without setting it up. I didn't do any of those team pictures. I
Yeah.
actually worked like a photojournalist. And meanwhile, I had a friend whose name is Bruce Rubin. Bruce is the person who wrote, I think it's called Ghost, very famous film in the 80s, I think.
Oh, yes. Oh, wow.
Where the
Yeah.
man dies and he comes back to his
Yeah,
life.
Whoopi Goldberg. Is it Whoopi? No, not Whoopi Goldberg. Yeah, Whoopi Goldberg is in it, I think.
I
Yeah.
don't
So
remember.
yeah.
But anyway, Bruce and I were close friends. And he was a theater director all the way through high school. At any rate, being that, he decided he wanted to learn film and went to New York Film School, New York University Film School. And he was doing his graduation film and asked me if I would come and photograph it and be with him for that time, which I did. And I saw what was going on, and I just fell in love with the idea of making films. And of course, it was just an extension of making photographs. So I'm ever since then. I've done both.
Yes. Yeah. That's amazing. I love, and we will show people some of your photographs in a minute, because they are just absolutely astounding. And if anybody does have any questions for Robert, please, send him a question, and if he can answer it, he will. So in terms of the value of storytelling, Robert, where that's what we're here to talk about today, speak to us a little bit about that, and take us through whatever.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a very complex subject, very big. So I can only really provide little morsels of thought for you. I should imagine in the end you'll wind up asking more questions than you feel you should be doing after somebody talks about it. But it's only to kind of light you up in the morning over your cup of tea. I think the first thing to think about is, what is the definition of a story? Very simply that. What we know is from, I think it's Middle English, the word history was developed. And history is known as a story of the past composed of so-called facts in the order in which they occurred. And I say so-called facts because what we know is that the victor always writes the history. And a story, if you think of it, a story without the HIS, history, a story is an invention of facts, characters, and events contrived by an artist, a poet, or a storyteller. And that is essentially the difference between the two, that people don't say, oh, if it's a story, it has to be based upon truth. It has to be based upon some truths, which are in fact the profound human truths, rather than the truth simply of the events of the past. I think the thing is that what has been realized more and more so lately is that not only does it seem like after the fact we begin to look at the histories that were written, and this is going on now in Britain in particular, about the period from slavery on. that the way in which the British interacted with the rest of the world is now beginning to be told properly. And what we see is the horror of what they did. And so I think what's happening is that people are beginning to say history has a certain relevance, at least in order to record fact. But it's possible that the myths and legends of the storytellers will turn out to be more profoundly true about who and what we are than the histories that documented the so-called reality.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important thing to think about, because again, I'll talk about this later, but it's about how our consciousness understands the universe that we live within.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing that's important in this, because by and large, what I do, how I've made my living, is through making images, film or stills, it really comes to count how one thinks about visual literacy. We live in a period where we've actually moved from having a culture which is by and large a culture based upon words to a culture based upon pictures. But that doesn't mean that people can read pictures. You know, they haven't had the long history of reading words as they have of reading pictures as they have of reading words. And I think that if you want to be somebody working in the visual arts, you really have to ask yourself the question: what do I understand about using images to tell stories? And in some ways, obviously, it's more symbolic, or I should say metaphoric, because in the words you can say virtually precisely what you want to say, particularly in English, which is such a wonderful language in terms of the ability to describe, in particular, emotional states. Um, and I think that one of the things that I learned, I made for my sins 900 commercials for television. Now, now I have to say, although I enjoyed working with the crew, and I enjoyed making something out of usually nothing, because usually it was nothing, um, and particularly because almost everything I did was around food. So I won't tell you how guilty I am about that. But what working in commercials does is it teaches you absolute precision. The thing is that what one learns very quickly is you could have one frame out in an edit, and although people would never be able to say, I think it was the frame at the end of that shot 3 that was the problem for me, they would go, they would feel something was off, was wrong. And I think that's what's lovely about. Very often, for instance, when I ask people listen to people about reactions to my work, what I hear is that there is a level of criticism going on, which is fine, but I can see that they don't have um, the language, the verbal language, to express what it was that upset them. So I have to then read between the lines to understand what they're telling me. And I'm sure it's the same with music. You know, if I were to talk to you about something I heard, I don't have the language for it. So I wouldn't be able to say it, but you would be saying, yes, what he knows is that I just didn't hit that note at that point in the right way. Um, so, so I think it's that. And I think that, you know, for people working like I do in the visual world, you have to ask yourself these questions. One of the things that did become clear to me is that we had what were called pre-production meetings. Utterly boring meetings. Huge table with the art director and the salespeople from the agencies and the salespeople from the corporations that you were working for, and then the production team and so on. And it was utterly boring. You had to repeat everything 3 times. But whenever a client was invited to make a remark about what should be done, they always wound up saying the most prosaic thing. And I didn't blame them for it. There was no reason why that's why they had me there. And that's why I had the art directors there, because we were the ones who would translate what they said. But what it did teach me was that there is a profound difference between describing things and using those things and other things to evoke. So the difference between description and evocation. And always their default was description. So I know, why don't we put the pack in the in the second shot. That way
Yeah.
we'll have, this was always the kind of answer.
Yeah.
Let's put the pack in their hand while we're talking.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, virtually never did anything they have to say have any relevance to the filmmaking process.
Yeah.
But I think it was very important for me to understand that question of description versus evocation.
Yeah, Gabby's just saying here, Robert, if I am right, I have one of your images framed. Did you have an agent called Julian Seddon?
Yes, I did.
And she said, if so, my husband Pierre used to write music for some of your commercials.
Who
Pierre
was that?
Pierre Tubbs.
Oh, yes,
Yes, he used to write.
absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
how extraordinary.
So hi, Gabby, and Gabby's daughter is one of my best friends.
Oh,
So
lovely.
the world is very small.
It really is, isn't it?
So I would love to just show a couple of your pictures in the stream. Is that okay? Just so people can get an identification.
These are not from commercials.
No. So yeah. So could you explain a little bit about this picture for us?
Yeah, in the 1970s, I was working as a photojournalist, and as it turned out, the stories that I wanted to do and the jobs I was asked to do by various magazines and newspapers were always around essentially work and working class people. And so I only recognized this at the end of the 1990s, that what I had actually documented was the beginning of the demise of the British industrial working class. I mean, some of you who are old enough, like me, to remember the 70s, and some of you who know about the 70s understand it was a highly politicized period where British industry was in the doldrums. British management was absolutely dead set against anything that the unions wanted. What they did want all the time was to cut wages. People were unemployed, made redundant. It's an extraordinary expression, I think. At any rate, this man was an ex-miner who was stealing the coal that he had dug from the rail tracks that connected the colliery to the power station.
Wow.
And as the trains went along, they would bump along, and the coal would fall off underneath and along the side of the tracks. And this was absolutely forbidden. They were not allowed to do this because they had to go buy their coal.
Yes.
At any rate, and you could see the fence along the side where he would
Yeah,
sneak
let's
through.
have a think. No, it doesn't make it bigger like that. I think this is the biggest it's going to stay. But it's beautiful.
And I remember I walked up to him and I asked him if he would like to give me his name. And he looked up at me and he said, "I'm nothing. I'm nothing. Even my kids look at me and they know I'm nothing."
Oh,
He said, "I'd top myself if I could." And it was just, I mean, this is what unemployment did to people.
yeah.
I mean, this was a man who had been a proud miner for, 20 years of his life, 25 years of his life. And then he's made redundant. Because after all, what counts most is not people's well-being, but the profits of the collieries.
Yeah. Wow. And then if we go on to this story here.
At the same time in the 1970s, I did some of you may remember a magazine called Nova. It was a very glossy magazine that had hard-hitting photo documentary work in it and fashion. And I supplied them with a number of stories. But one of the stories that I was asked to do was to photograph Brixton. Now, my natural tendency was to think Brixton meant the people who were living there. As it turned out, in a very big explosive meeting that I had with the editors, was that Brixton to them meant the opportunity for middle-class people to buy these gorgeous large houses that were all around Brixton and the exotic marketplace. And anyway, but throughout the 1970s, because of the relationships I built with people in the Black community, I was constantly being passed on from person to person. So, as an example, somebody said to me, "My cousin's getting married on the weekend. They'd love you to come." What they meant was they'd love me to come, have a drink, listen to the music, but also photograph. But that was fine. That was fine. It was a good exchange. And I got into all sorts of places that I think that normally a stranger or an outsider wouldn't be allowed into or wouldn't be invited into naturally.
Yeah.
And what was so lovely about it and so graceful was that once people understood that you were okay, and
Yeah.
they, the amazing thing is always, it's like they understand that you're just a human being. You're
Yeah.
just with them. You're not looking down at them. You're not seeing them as a specimen of this or that. You're
Mm.
seeing them as human beings. You're laughing with them. You're joking with them. You're having a drink with them. And it was beautiful. I mean, really was beautiful. And I made lots of, I wouldn't say friends because I was always on the move, but I made lots
Yeah.
of very nice relationships with people.
Yeah, I have to say I really identify with that. I mean, when I used to live in Derry, you know, with all the troubles that happened there, it 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 did take people time to recognize that I wasn't there, as a threat, that I was just there as, somebody who really wanted to get to know the people of Derry. I was working at McGee University at the time, and you do find that you just say we're just human beings, and when we meet each other as human beings, these wonderful, magical relationships form. So yeah, I can really identify with that. That
Yeah.
yeah. But what I love about these two things, Robert, is these two photographs is the emotionality that we see in both of these pictures, and that they actually really tell a story of and what I know that you love is an emotional story.
It's the thing is that when you realize that if you're shooting at a 200th of a second, every second you have 200 opportunities to take the picture.
I think that's astounding. I just think that's an astounding.
And so you multiply that by the number of seconds in a minute and so on, and you realize you could just be going, tit, 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 tit,
Yeah.
Um, and the thing is, very often I wait with the camera against my eye. I wait and wait and wait
Mm.
because I saw something that was possible earlier on.
Mm.
And I wait for that absolutely precise moment to occur. So
Mm.
I've always photographed very little. I
Yeah.
don't go bang, 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 bang. I wait for what I think is the moment.
Mm.
There's a very famous photographer, some of you may know of, called Henri Cartier-Bresson, who is
Mm.
the founder of a very famous organization called Magnum. Cartier-Bresson established Magnum in the late 40s, just after the war. And he developed what was called the decisive moment, where he understood that the consummate moment to release the shutter is the moment where the maximum expression, emotional expression, is at its peak,
Mm.
and the coming together of the forms in the picture, the bodies of the people, were also at their peak. So you can imagine, for instance, there's a horrible moment where the Japanese prime minister in the 1960s, I think, is being attacked
Mm.
with somebody with a knife, huge knife. The photographer photographed it at the moment of impact, and
Oh.
it's just extraordinary photograph.
Mm.
Um, but I mean, it really is that about the decisive moment.
Mm. Mm.
And a little bit later on, the lesson was taught to me by the fact that when motorized cameras came out, I had a friend who was a photojournalist,
Mm.
and he showed me a set of pictures he had done in Africa of people dancing.
Mm.
And there's this one picture in particular, well, a set of pictures because he was using the motor drive, where the person jumps into the air, gets
Mm.
to the peak, and then drops. Now, obviously, at the peak of emotion, you're not moving because you're going from up to down. And
Mm.
that's always the moment to shoot because you freeze the image.
Mm.
And I said to him, there's something about it doesn't work.
Mm.
It's like you don't really have the moment here.
Mm.
You have before and you have after, but you don't have the moment. And
Mm.
he said, yeah, I'm just learning how to use the motor drive. And of course, the motor drive meant that you weren't using your brain and your eyes.
Mm.
You were suddenly using the mechanism to just hopefully capture it.
Mm.
And of course, what one has to do, if you think about it, like in shooting theater, it's the same as shooting on the streets. You have to know that the moment is coming,
Mm.
because by the time you see the moment and your brain says, press the shutter, you press the shutter works. The moment's passed by at least a second.
Yeah.
You've lost it. You've lost the key moment. So you
Yeah.
actually have to be expecting that moment to occur.
Yeah. 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 So as you keep telling us about the value of storytelling, where are we next in your
Well, there's just a couple points which people probably know of, but I'll say these at any rate because from the point of view of photographing it, slightly different perhaps. Um, I think that I asked myself, what are stories for?
Mm.
And I think the obvious answer is that they're for us to discover who and what we are.
Mm.
And part of that then refers back to the myths and legends of where we come from. I mean, every society has their origin stories.
Mm.
Where do they come from? You know, what gave them birth?
Mm.
Um, but I think also, for me as a child growing up, uh, Detroit was an incredibly racist city,
Mm.
and my family were racist.
Mm.
And for various reasons, uh, I didn't have the racist gene in me, it seemed.
Mm.
One of these reasons was that although my family was a lower middle class family with not very much
Mm.
money, they still could afford to hire the girl who
Mm.
was a young black woman who came in once a week. And
Mm.
I had a very strange family who weren't very kind.
Mm.
Um, and this young woman was so sweet to me.
Mm.
So obviously my experience, my
Mm.
growing human experience, was with this lovely woman who
Mm.
happened to be black.
Mm.
And I would then hear my brother and my father and my uncles making racist comments. I couldn't figure it. I thought, how could they have this person in their house and see
Mm.
who and what she was,
Mm.
and yet be this kind of generalized racist with
Mm.
their awful comments?
Mm.
At any rate, when I was about 14,
Mm.
and by then a really serious young photographer,
Mm.
I came across the work of an American lefty named Paul
Mm.
Strand,
Mm.
who had done a number of books around the world, in France and in Italy and in Nigeria and in Egypt and in Newfoundland and other places. And he basically made three kinds of photographs. He made portraits, either singular or collective.
Mm.
He made broad landscapes or cityscapes, and he did very big close-ups of the tools of that civilization.
Mm.
And through bringing those things together, he would give one a picture of that society
Mm.
using those three elements. It was very interesting.
Mm.
But what was so wonderful for me was that I saw that the dignity with which he photographed a farmer's wife in
Mm.
Newfoundland
Mm.
was the same dignity that he brought to bear
Mm.
photographing a Nigerian girl in a village
Mm.
or an
Mm.
Egyptian worker on a farm.
Mm.
And I looked at these.
Mm.
I loved his photographs. I just loved them.
Mm.
And you know, he didn't know it, but he became a mentor of mine, like several
Mm.
other photographers
Mm.
in my young life.
Mm.
Um, but what I recognized was there was no racism in his pictures. He didn't look down on some people and hold other people up. For him, everybody was the same because he was an American communist from the 1930s, and his idea was we are the people. The people of the world are the people. We are all one.
Mm.
And that's what he showed in his books.
Mm.
And I thought, this man, who I respect and don't know, who's older than me,
Mm.
is showing me that my understanding of being a non-racist made
Mm.
perfect sense to him.
Mm.
And so in my life, I thought, okay, I'm with Paul, not with my father, not with my uncles.
Mm.
And that was really powerful and that shows how, I mean, my book that Nadine talked about earlier
Mm.
is, in the first chapter, is about how I, as a young person,
Mm.
grew and developed, not through only reading books, which I did, but also through looking at photographs and paintings and sculptures.
Please,
Um,
have you got your book there so they can have a look at what it looks like? Anywhere. Yes, the role. Yeah, there we go. The Role for Artists in Troubled Times. It is a brilliant book. I love it. So if you can support Robert and get the book, please do, because you will have your world opened, I have to say. It's great. Beautiful piece of work.
We needed one of those flashing stars saying bye, bye, bye.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say it was great if it wasn't. So it just really is. It is a whole experience in itself, the book.
Thank you. At any rate, so that I think that's an example for me of how culture, visual culture, informed my life and really transformed me. And I lived in this private world of photographs, and that's what I wanted to do more and more of.
Yeah.
The second point really is that I think that, as I just gave an example of, stories offer us a way out of the darkness.
Mm.
We need storytelling as human beings. And in particular, in this awful period that we've been in, and hopefully it will be slightly different now, that we need models of humanity. We need, I ask children, who are your heroes? But don't tell me, I don't want to know about any singers. Just tell me who your heroes are. And they go, I don't have any. And I thought, this is extraordinary. When I was growing up, I had heroes.
Mm.
And I had heroes because they represented to me not only kinds of actions that I would like to follow, but also a morality
Mm.
that allowed me to understand how I could find some guidance in my life.
Mm.
And that was the way out of the darkness. And I think what we're seeing right now, very simply, that Trump offered divisiveness, he offered racial hatred, he offered a world that was inherently against, I know this may sound difficult for people, but against American values. Now, I grew up with those values, and for me, America has actually left them behind. So when I go to America, it's another country for me. I don't know that country. I don't know this country. People have become incredibly preoccupied with the idea, well, with avarice and greed, rather than the concept of community. And I grew up with the idea that community is something that you take part in, that you believe in. And I think that what Biden has done is he said, it's time to come together again. And I think that's why he was elected, because if you look at what happened, the Republicans did incredibly well everywhere, but Trump didn't. And I think that's the difference, that those Republican values, which I dislike intensely, are still dominant in America, which is why one of the reasons why I don't like the country very much. But it really became too much, even for the religious maniacs in the Midwest, to say, we can't accept this man. He is totally immoral. That's why the electorate turned against him. And it's the two competing stories. And they decided, we don't like Joe so much, but Joe's saying, come together. Let us come together. And again, that's how stories work in politics.
Yeah.
I think there's one more point, which is that my wife and I would very often, because we go to London a lot for work, meetings and so on, we get on the train about either 4 or 5 o'clock to come back to Dorset. And almost everybody is there. If they're not sleeping, they're there doing, what's it called, Sudoku, the
Yeah.
Japanese game, or crossword puzzles, or looking at a film on their mobiles, or reading a book. And I wondered about that. And I looked at it many, many times and saw the concentration and the calm that seemed to be around these people. And I had the fortune of bumping into a Bosnian psychologist that I knew. And she had dealt with trauma, obviously from Bosnia. And I asked her about what she thought about this. And she said, it's very simple. She said, most people's lives are deeply fragmented, especially by what they do. That if you work in a factory, you only put a hubcap on. You don't make the whole car. If you work in an office, you go yes, no to that series on the paper that has to be dealt with and passed through to the next person. And she said, because of this way of working now, there's no sense of wholeness in the individual, in the personality. And so when they get on the train, they want to do something that they can complete. And that sense of completion is a kind of parallel for the others who are reading stories that will have a beginning and a middle and an end.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
And I thought, isn't that interesting? I mean, that it shows how vital it is for us to share our stories and
yeah.
why we've done it for century upon century, sitting around the campfire.
And you, in your sense of story, I know that you had a moment where you were with Martin Luther King. I mean, can you? Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Very quickly.
Okay.
I was there's a number of reasons why I wound up being thrown out of my first university, and wound up in the University of Michigan, which is one of the three major centers of radicalism during the 1960s.
Yeah.
And there's an organization called the Students for Democratic Society. If anybody's seen the film Chicago, they'll know, because that's what the main organization is that's talked about in the film.
Yeah.
And many of the people came from University of Michigan. At
Yeah.
any rate, the SDS had a liaison with black groups in the South, and in the 1960s, you will remember, that was the period of the mighty civil rights movement.
Yeah.
And the Selma March had just occurred, the first Selma March,
I
where
know this isn't that, but yeah.
people were badly beaten and one person killed. I think it was one person. And what the civil rights movement recognized was that if they could get white students down to Selma, Alabama, or to Montgomery, which is the capital, which is where the Selma people were trying to march to hand in a petition to George Wallace, the then very, very racist governor of Alabama. And they thought, let us get a group of white people down, join with the black kids in the high schools, and march to the building and hand in the scroll. So for various reasons, I became one of those people who went from University of Michigan. And we arrived and graciously greeted by the black community. Absolutely lovely, warm, humane, kind, and good food. And and the next morning, we get together, we march through the high schools, gather a lot of kids with us, and we start towards the state building. And we see it in the distance along this huge avenue. And suddenly, out of nowhere, these state troopers came and closed us in front of us. Shotguns in their hands. Kids. We were kids. I don't know what I was, 19 or 20 maybe. And they said, you can't go on, and you have to disband. The same old malarkey that they always do. And as they started shoving us slowly down the street, we were surrounded from behind by motorcyclists, state troopers on motorcycles. And then, strangely enough, the state troopers in front of us pulled back a little bit, and in came these gigantic farm horses, mounted by strange men in white uniforms with white hats. And they were each carrying a long cane, and on the end of the cane was taped either a claw hammer or a tire iron, with those sort of pointed ends. And then all hell broke loose. They turned their horses and they charged through us while the motorcycles were coming from the other direction. And one kid suffered permanent brain damage. I saw a young woman who I knew from University of Michigan fall down. And what they did was they would buck their horses and try and get them to land on the body of the person underneath their horse, breaking their ribs or whatever. Anyway, I saw her go down, and I ran through the horses and grabbed her and just dragged her out of the struggle to to a space between two buildings. And as I turned to see what was going on and whether we were safe, I didn't hear the horse that had come up behind me, who was then bucked, and his knees caught me, and I flew through the air. Fortunately, I was wearing my camera, and I landed on a stump. But fortunately, I can still have children because the camera took the blunt of the hit, destroyed my camera, but allowed me to be able to have a child. Anyway, I was very badly bruised. That night, the walking wounded were asked to come to a very small wooden church in the center of the black area in Montgomery, which we did. There were about, I don't know, I can't remember really, about 36 kids there. Well, kids, young people. And at some point, after we gathered, the door opens, and who should it be but Martin Luther King?
Wow.
And he came and sat with us and talked about the movement and thanked us. And I have to say that I could almost never hear his voice without tears coming to my eyes. Anyway, when he finished, we with him walked to the front door, which was the only door, and we realized that the street was lit up by torches. The KKK had shown up and completely surrounded the building along with their friends, the state troopers. And so there we are in a tinderbox with these guys with their torches. And we were trapped there from about 8 o'clock until about 2 o'clock in the morning. Had a long conversation with Martin Luther King, but it was frightening. It was obviously very frightening.
Yeah.
And at around 2 o'clock or so, we started hearing some noise outside, and we went to the windows in the front door. And it was as though the invisible telegraph had connected everybody. Obviously, somebody recognized that Martin wasn't where he should have been. So once it became obvious what was going on, the entire community, and I mean entire community, grandparents and parents and children and infants, came out on their porches and slowly started moving towards the troopers. And of course, they didn't know what to do. They had never seen anything like this before. And here was a community self-organizing, being able to respond to a crisis. And they disappeared like water down a mountain. They just disappeared. And anyway, it was an extraordinary experience. And it obviously affected me, not because of the fear. I'd already had a lot of that fear, and I had a lot more afterwards, demonstrations and so on. But just whatever people say about Martin Luther King, he was an extraordinarily beautiful person, and goodness was he wise. And I think that when I talk about storytelling, I because of the nature of our culture now, which I could get to in a moment if interested, but there's a preoccupation in the last 40 years. If you haven't lived through the last 40 years before that, you can't see the change that's occurred. But in the last 40 years, the emphasis in our society has gone from we to me, from history to psychology, and from producer to consumer. And those changes are fundamental in the way we think about our lives and each other. But what concerns me, and particularly when I teach young people, is the fact that their worlds are so small that they think only of themselves. And I think it's a very interesting question to ask when you're thinking about storytelling. Am I telling my story? Am I telling my story through other people? Am I imposing upon other people my understanding of my wants and needs? And the question you have to ask is, do you know that much? And are you that interesting that I'm going to sit and watch a film of yours of an hour and a half? I think it's a really important question. Some people are, some people aren't. But it's very rare that when you're quite young, that your story is as interesting as older people's stories.
So Marjorie is just saying, what a story. And here's a question. If you can answer it, do. If you can't, please don't. he said, coming back to the subject of, Francis Griffin is saying, coming back to the subject of young people and their heroes, and without wanting to be provocative, what would you say to a young person whose hero was Trump? Because he's saying, I have to say, I have very few ideas.
You know, I think that one of the things we have to worry about right now is in every major industrial country is the fact that, I'm sorry, this is going to be an answer that goes around the houses a little bit, but you'll if you stick with me, you'll
You're
get
going to
it.
have to shorten it for me, though, so I can get on to your tips.
Okay. The thing is that the right have been always able to tell their story. It's usually based upon jingoism, nationalism, racism, the superiority of this group or that group, which we belong to as opposed to them, the dehumanization of other people. Very easy, very simple. And when you educate a population like the British and the Americans do, um, which I know is a whole other question I won't get into, but when you educate them so that in fact you don't teach them anything about critical thinking and you squash their imaginations at the same time, then you have people who will develop along certain lines where they're desperate. And globalization has left millions of people in the Anglo-American world with poor educations, poor health, poor culture, subject to the dominant culture, which is infantile to say the least, and um, allows them to stew in their own uneducated juices. I don't blame the people for a moment because it's not their fault. The fault is with the 0.1%, the 10% who institute those things to lead us down a dark path. So one of the ways out of this, I think, when you recognize that as soon as you attack somebody's politics, you're actually attacking their education, their history, family history, their culture, their understanding, the facts that they think are true, the knowledge they develop from that, and probably a total lack of wisdom. And you see that when you hear the interviews with people here about Johnson or there about Trump. And when you recognize that, I think the best thing to do is ask questions. Ask them, tell me why you think that. Who's telling you that that is true? Is that coming out of you, or has somebody told you? And now the best thing to do is think, what is the vested interest of the person who has told you that? Which is also, as you were taught in history, follow the money, because that's always the answer. Follow the money. The money wants you to believe this. So I would say that put your anger and your resentment aside and sit down and have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or whatever it is and say, talk to me. I want to understand. And I think it's through that human contact that people might just wake up. And in particular, when they're asked questions they can't answer, because they will not be able to answer them.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Marjorie is saying, so right about from we to me. She says, I have seen that individualism rise in my lifetime. Francis, I hope that goes some way to answering your question from Robert. Thank you very much for asking. Please continue to ask questions if you would like. In terms of storytelling, Robert, are we there in your kind of what you wanted to share with us, or are we okay to go on to the tips? What would tell me? If you've got a little bit more about storytelling, please say.
No, I could go on. You could talk about the tips.
Okay, so if somebody wanted to get into filmmaking, photography, could you, or even, whichever one you wish to express, what 3 tips would you give them?
Okay, well, these are probably generalized because I think that anybody who wants to write poetry or live a life could actually ask the same could actually have the same tips.
Yeah.
The thing that school extinguishes in children is curiosity and imagination. And I think that if you think you want to do something creative, that's great because that's the first step. But what you need to do is constantly engage. Why? So important. Why this? Why that? And remember, as children, we did that. And
Yeah.
until your mother said, "Oh, go away, leave me alone." You know. Um, but that's the natural inclination of the child. Why this and why that?
Mm,
And in school, it's the same thing until they're told that, you shouldn't do that. You'll get in trouble because you're
mm,
asking too many questions.
mm,
And that kind of oppressiveness is horrible. So I think that what you have to do, those of us who are rebellious,
mm,
who basically have said to the institutions all our lives, screw you. If I want to ask, I will ask. If I want to be curious, I will be curious. I will ask those awkward questions. And
mm,
what other is art for, if not asking those questions?
mm, mm,
Um, very often it's the artists who understand what is going on in the society around them and
mm,
actually clarify it, which is, if you think about it, almost every movement that isn't supportive of the status quo's ideas takes at least 20 years to be acceptable. Why?
mm,
Because that's a generation. And it means
mm,
that generation is no longer threatened by what they said 20 years earlier. So
yeah.
that you can absorb what they've said. Anyway, curiosity and the other thing that schools destroy, well, they don't even fabricate, let alone destroy, is critical thinking.
Mm,
To try and develop a way of saying to yourself, I'm really interested in that. How do I understand it?
mm,
And that's again a way that you can approach the Trumpites.
mm, mm,
Explain it to me. If
mm,
you think that you don't get up in the morning and think you're evil, and
mm,
yet let's think about the consequences of what you're saying. Let's
mm,
just look at those consequences.
mm,
And I think with these two things comes something which is really important that we have to maintain always in our lives, which is a sense of wonder.
mm,
I mean, at my age, I still sense wonder,
mm,
often in other people.
mm,
When I see something that I say, isn't that wonderful? That
mm,
they can do that, they can say that, they can think that, they can be that.
mm,
I mean, it's a beautiful thing, and it's
mm,
part of the beauty of the earth for me.
mm,
Um, and I think then that when you get to that point, and particularly when you're young, but it's true all through your life,
mm,
yes, you need to look, but you need to see while you're looking.
mm,
And yes, you need to hear, but you need to listen while you're hearing.
mm,
It's so fascinating when you just stop and you take your ego out from in front of you and you just look at the world and listen to the world and take in what it has to offer.
mm,
Sometimes very often it's absurd.
mm,
Very often it's incredibly funny. Very often it's tragic.
mm,
But it's those things that you see in what we might call normal people. I don't know what that means really. Um, that is quite moving, and I've seen it all my life. I've seen people do things
mm,
that are really extraordinary.
mm,
That for them they just did naturally because that's who they are.
mm, mm,
And what I teach people when I teach them um, is the first thing I usually say to them is I want you to ask this question:
mm,
why do you believe that what you believe to be true is true?
mm,
Not how is your truth different than somebody else's, but why do you believe what you believe is true?
mm,
It's a very critical question, and I think it opens up, particularly with curiosity and
mm,
critical thinking, I think it opens up a whole world to oneself.
mm,
And I think that when you come to realize that all your beliefs have somehow been washed into you or
mm,
seemingly inherited, but from where, from whom, and for what reason?
yeah.
Why do I believe this thing which is so contradictory? Why do I believe I should go kill somebody else's sons
Yeah.
with a gun for my national pride, my
Mm,
national interest, which
mm,
usually means actually the interests of the munitions makers and the banks, I
mm,
have to say. But that that's how you see it.
yeah.
And also to understand that you've been educated by people with a, a, an idea about who and what you should be.
Mm,
You are surrounded by a popular culture, which is by and large manufactured by large corporations who are owned by very, very wealthy people who are serving other wealthy people.
mm,
And so yeah, aren't those American soldiers great? I mean, they're so good with each other. They're heroic. Well, yeah, they just did kill a large number of people, but it doesn't matter because they're subhumans, because they're wearing towels on their heads, or they have black skin, or whatever it happens to be. And those are the things that become inculcated in us, that we begin to say, yeah, yeah, we should do that because that's American. I'm American. You know, it's all that crap that's laid upon us. I just want to say quickly, Einstein said, you can only solve a problem, you cannot solve a problem with the same kind of thinking that went into creating the problem, which says to us, anybody who's critical, whether it's a radical political person or whether it's an artist, it says you have to stand back. You have to look and listen and see for yourself what is real and what's not real. And why is it that so often what you see happening is counterintuitive to what you say life should be? And I think a lot of us wake up in the morning and say, you know, I think I had COVID a couple of months ago, and it was awful. But I think that what I had was nothing next to what, all the deaths. And I think all of us in this period right now, probably around the world, we can live our lives and be as we wish to be and tell our own stories, but at the same time, we know all those other stories are going on.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, it's helping to create depression in a lot of people because it's hurtful. And it's naturally hurtful because we're part of the species. And we see the rest of our species suffering. That was point one.
Marjorie is just saying, I have seen that a lot of that. Oh yeah, she said that. She said, what a wise man. Education has become so utilitarian. Asking questions is the way. And Marjorie says, oh, I love Robert's philosophy. Education crushes the curiosity out of children, and it's a deliberate policy. Marjorie's a brilliant author herself. She is one of the top leaders in children's education and teaching them new ways to think. And Gabrielle Tubbs, it's been wonderful to meet you again. Your stories and wisdom are inspiring.
Thank
you.
you.
Did you say that was only number one? So tip number two.
Do we have time for this?
No, go ahead. You're there.
Okay.
We're here, so let's do it.
Okay. I think this practice works for many, many things in life, and I've used it all my life to try and figure out what the next stage is, what I do tomorrow, and what do I do aiming for 5 years from now.
Yeah.
In order to make a film, films are really complex. They really are. You cannot underestimate them. And I've made, I don't know, probably close to 50 different kinds of films now.
Yeah.
And I tell you, it doesn't get any easier. Because the more you know, the more you want to dispose yourself towards doing those things, the more refined it becomes, and so on. But the thing is this, in particular, if you're not using a scripted story, in other words, you're not doing a feature film as in storytelling, but you're doing a documentary, which is essentially a history.
Or a her story, but you know what I mean.
Exactly. You have to develop what's called the high concept.
Yeah.
And the high concept comes easily from mind mapping. And probably a lot of people understand what mind mapping is. But
I'll take these down as well. There's a couple of books that I have on the guy that created this stuff, Tony Buzan, mind mapping. He does that. So if that's useful to anybody. Yeah.
Well, and in the first chapter of my book, there's an explanation. Is it the first chapter? Second chapter. There's an explanation about how to do it in relationship to making pictures. The thing is, if you say that there are people and people's organizations which affect your life right now, at this time, write down those that are positively and negatively affecting you. So it's not just the good things; it's the bad things as well. Then you have ideas, concepts, philosophies that exist in the society, and it may be a preoccupation with liberation, with equality, with Catholicism. I mean, whatever it happens to be, those are ideas, concepts that you write down if they are in any way affecting you at the moment. And the third thing is emotions.
Mm.
What emotions are dominant in your life at the moment?
Mm.
I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of emotions,
Mm.
but there will be dominant ones, which are either positive or negative in your life at the moment. I think it's really critical that you think of the good things as well as the bad things.
Mm. Or
I
the
mean,
opportunities as well as the challenges, regardless if depending on the way you think.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I've been married to my extraordinarily wonderful wife for, I can't remember how many years, a lot of years.
a lot of years.
And recently she taught me that there was a glass that could be half full or half empty.
Mm.
Now, it took me a long time to recognize there was even a glass. I'm such a depressive. Um, but every once in a while, I recognize that it's half full.
Yeah,
So, so I think it's really important that you account for that because that's part of who you are.
yeah.
And and once you do that, you can synthesize that
Mm.
into a set of preoccupations. And I would ask you, why would you make a film about anything else if these are the things that are really, really important to you?
Mm.
So the difficult part comes in taking those things that you care about
Mm.
and transforming them by nominating subject matter.
Mm.
You need subject matter that expresses that.
Mm.
Particularly, I mean, if you're writing a fiction, then you
Mm.
can create it. But if you're making a documentary, you have
Mm.
to find it in the world.
Mm.
And when you do that, when you understand what that is, I would say sit down and just write
Mm.
300 words.
Mm.
If you write more than that, get it down to 300 words.
Mm.
You're not showing this to people. This is for yourself. It's absolutely private. Once you're happy with the 300 words, cut it down to 100 words.
Mm.
That's really difficult. But then you realize, I didn't need that adjective. I didn't have to say that in two different ways.
Mm.
I didn't need that adverb. I can shorten this phrase, etc., and get it down to 100 words.
Mm.
And what you very often find is that when you do that, something starts not making sense in what you wrote in the 300 words. And then
Mm.
you realize actually what you're doing is clarifying your thought.
Mm.
And you have to go back and realign the 300 words.
Mm.
And you get it down to the 100 words. And then you say, okay, now I'm going to get it down to 15 words. That's a real challenge. In other words, it's a sentence or the high concept. In Hollywood, they used to call it the elevator pitch because the writer would get in on the ground floor with the owner of the studio and he'd have two floors to pitch the idea in. So about 7 words per floor. He could say, oh, my film is about, and the head of the studio would say, yeah, write that up, let me see it. Or say, nothing doing about it. Okay, so it has to be really, really clear. So
Mm.
that when somebody says to you, what are you doing? You're saying, I'm making a film about that. Those don't have to count as part of the 15 words. It's the about that counts.
Mm.
And it's interesting to see people's reactions, whether they blink a couple of times and say, that's very nice and walk away, or whether they ask you a question.
Mm.
So that development needs to occur.
And
And
what about the third point, the number 3 tip?
um, yeah, um, this it's complicated. It's it's really important to be able to separate form from content.
Okay.
That is to say, the look of an image. What is
Mm.
that? That is the forms within the composition, the frame itself, what's inside, what's outside, how sharp or soft those things are, how dark or light, what the contrast range is, whether you use monochrome or color, etc., etc. That is the form of the picture.
Mm.
If the form is not successful, it doesn't support the content. It's like building the platform and the surrounding curtain with the
Mm.
form, and then the content plays upon it.
Mm. Mm.
If um, if you understand that there is a profound difference, and yet the two are completely merged,
Mm.
you're a good way towards understanding about picture making and about filmmaking.
Mm.
Uh, you can, I've seen pictures. I've seen pictures of people. The content is kind of, I've seen it before. It's okay,
Mm.
but the form is deadly. Or the other way around,
Mm.
where the form is absolutely exquisite, but there's no content. And I see
Yeah.
this endlessly online. I see just pictures of people,
Mm.
beautiful technique, beautiful compositions,
Mm.
and meaningless. I can't even remember what the pictures were 10 minutes later.
Mm. Mm.
So I think that that unity is very, very important. And
Yeah.
this will take me to the last point, which is everybody, I think, involved in fiction or in factual, has to concern themselves with truth telling.
Mm.
If you don't concern yourself with truth telling, I don't know what you're doing.
Mm. Mm.
And um, that means overcoming the culture that you've been brought up with, this the Einstein thing. Stand away
Mm.
and look, and really look as a
Mm.
human being into the heart of darkness and see what's going on there, and be able to find ways to transform that into entertaining stories. And
Mm.
even when I'm telling a dark story, which I've done, it has to be entertaining. It has to pull people along. Otherwise, it's bang. You know,
Oh, this is a beautiful, I think this tells a beautiful story straight away. I just think this, it's just really there in the moment. We're seeing these two women. She looks like she's saying something to her as she's going, like, come on, sit down
it's
and let's
gossip.
talk. Yeah, it's such a beautiful moment to witness, and I think I really hear you on that. Francis Griffin is saying it's too easy and a bit hurtful to blame education and teachers for setting children on the wrong path. It's not my experience at all. I try to teach my children to think, not what to think, and generally speaking, their teachers were very supportive. And Laurie, I actually agree with you. And I was going to say this to Francis before, but you've come in, so it's great. I think Robert is talking about problems in the education system and not individual teachers who sometimes struggle as much as the pupils in it, especially with the defunding of arts and humanities in the UK. We won't bring that discussion up anymore, but it's really, we're hearing everything. And I think I would agree with Laurie there about what Robert was alluding to.
Well, let me just say quickly to Francis, I, I work in a school that we have a charity down in Bridport, and I'm very often in there photographing, and I've watched the teachers and I watch the children, and the teachers are incredibly hardworking and are devoted, but that doesn't mean they're right. What it does mean is that they really care,
Mm.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that what they follow is the right way to teach children. And I think there's a lot of really good criticism out there about how children need to be allowed to play, to have their lives opened up in school and not closed down and just sitting in rows and watching teachers talk. Anyway, but I agree, and I think Laurie's absolutely right.
Yeah, and then Marjorie says, I meant the government's agenda. Individual teachers often have to go under the radar to give children the chance to really think and imagine and be curious. I meet loads of wonderful teachers who have to struggle against Ofsted. So yeah, so we're all saying the same
Yeah,
thing
yeah, absolutely.
underneath in the true way. So that's great. And Marjorie is an amazing leader of play. So I mean, what you're saying is, you have some great leaders in here of that actual thing. So I am going to have to close up because we're kind of getting to, but I wanted to just quickly talk about your film. You are having a film called This Good Earth coming out on the 21st of January,
Yeah.
2020. And I would love for you just to spend a little bit of time just talking about the film and where people can find it.
Right. Well, I think I gave you the URL for it.
Yeah. I'll get that.
But if you go to the website of the film, which is the URL, then you can see the trailer there,
Yeah.
and get an idea about the film is. But I just very quickly tell you a story about telling stories around the film, which is that my original idea was to tell a holistic story so that people would understand that actually the use of the soil and the growing of the crops relates through a very long food chain, through multiple corporations, to ending with two consequences. One is starvation in a lot of the world, where these corporations dump food and destroy the ability of farmers locally to make a living. And the other is that they are causing obesity and all sorts of degenerative diseases, including heart disease, cancer, etc., in the large parts of the population who are underfed, undernourished because of a consequence of not being paid sufficiently, not having enough state aid, and suffering from the fact that they can only afford cheap foods, which are now being called ultra processed, that have not only very little food value, but also are deleterious to the well-being of the body. They're actually causing disease to occur. So that was the original idea. But then I don't have a scientific mind. And I wound up interviewing scientists and medical professionals for the film, as well as farmers and other people. And I was, I have to say, overwhelmed by not only their knowledge, but their passion to use their knowledge to make a better world. That so interested me because I never I know it's stupid, but I never thought of it. I thought to find people, they're bright, and so on. But their dedication, and sometimes they'd say, could you turn off the camera? Which I would do. And they would rant about this world that we share. But they couldn't do that publicly because it might jeopardize their work or their job or their relationships. At any rate, but what became clear in listening to them talk was the fact that every single one of them, and I mean every single one of them that I interviewed, said in one way or another, the problem is profits or capitalism. That capitalism is not working for the people. And this is a real problem. And that I would then say to them, okay, well, I got it. You know the answers. You know what could be done. And some of these things are already being used in the Southern Hemisphere. Why isn't it being done here? I know it sounds like another naive question, but I had to ask them that question to see what they would say. And every one of them said, it's the corporations and the politicians who are in the way. And I thought, okay, now these corporations and these politicians know, well, the corporations anyway, know exactly what they're doing. They have projections into the future, like the coal industry, the oil industry had in the 1980s, understanding that they would cause what is happening now to global warming. They knew that then. So I brought in a lawyer who's a human rights lawyer who now deals with questions of climate change, and at a very high level internationally, very bright man, a very kind man. And I said to him, if people are conscious of the fact they're going to be causing more and more deaths, they already know they're causing deaths, why aren't these people accused? Why aren't they arrested? I don't understand. I mean, what's the difference between them and an SS officer walking down the street? So they have their suit and a tie rather than the beautiful uniform of the SS officers. But what's the difference in them? They are causing death. They are literally murdering people. And one of the facts I've got is over 93,000 children under the age of 5 die every single day in the world because of some food-related problem, which is a combination of starvation, hunger, and lack of nutrients. And between 500 and 800,000 infants die every year because of being given dried powdered milk. That's the whole thing about sterilization and so on.
So we get these. So we get these other stories in the film as we go along.
But you also get a conclusion in the film. What should happen?
Okay.
And I thought this film has got to point the finger.
Okay, brilliant. So I've left the HTTP down there, thisgoodearth.com, if you would like to support Robert and get the film going and let other people know about the film, which is coming out on January the 21st, 2021. Robert, thank you. I mean, this has got to be the longest interview I think I've ever done. Which is hilarious, but it's really lovely to have had you here and to listen to your ideas and your thought processes, and to just look at your wonderful work and pictures. And I can't wait to to watch the film, and the book, The Artist in Troubled Times, is just amazing. So if anybody would like to get that book, please, please, please support that book, because it is fundamentally really a moving, engaging experience, and has totally changed my world and thinking. And I love what you say about critical thinking. And I also love, you know, that your feelings around education. We have a lot of artists on here that really support teachers, and because every teacher has given all of us, even myself, I have a Mrs. Lake who was an amazing teacher for me. So I understand what you're saying about the conformities of what they have to work with within the system that is built, you know. So and that is also, you know, where we come back to in terms of racism, the systemic, you know, of how the system is built. And I think with the arts, and I think what you're showing with the arts, is that we can tell a different story. We can really allow people to have their own stories within the arts, and to have a sense of freedom within that. And yeah, I just find you astonishingly open, always willing to ask questions and be in relation with us, and to not let anybody feel like they're not worth anything, or you're just so giving and open and always alive and always thinking and always creating. And yeah, I just love you. I just think you're amazing. And I thank you so much for just sharing with us your ideas today. It's been phenomenal having you.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
If you're going to buy the book, if you can, call your local bookstore and ask them to order it rather than getting it on Amazon.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. They've heard you. They will do what they can.
Okay.
And thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate all of your time and for sharing this interview time with us. And I'll see you tomorrow morning with Rhonda Brown, the Mezzo Rhonda Brown. She's a phenomenal lady, and she will be talking about, you know, her passion for really teaching young singers, and a new line of young singers, and what they will do for the arts and how they will be in it. Okay, my loves, take care, and
Thank you, everybody.
So much. Take care.
Thanks, Nadine.